welcome to this briefing that we have this week on Young, Woke and Christian, Words from a Missing Generation, edited by Victoria Turner, who is on the call today, along with some other speakers. So I will introduce a few of the key speakers, and then for some of the contributors that we're also very lucky to have as well on the call, I will introduce them as we go along. So firstly, I want to turn to Victoria, a PhD candidate in World Christianity at the University of Edinburgh, trustee for Churches Together in England, and a member of the United Reformed Church. So hello and welcome, Victoria. Tell me, what brought you to even decide that this book needed to be out in the world?
Hi, Sorcha. Thank you so much for the invitation. Um, I think it was a growing understanding that young people were very much being kind of scapegoated in church communities. So the woke I kept finding was used to kind of silence these views of young people. Kind of when young people were like, climate change is so important, they'd be like, these woke young people protesting. Or like young people would be like, well, I really care that my friend's gay and they can't get married in the church. And it would be like, again, these woke things that are outside of the church. So after a few of these encounters, I kind of just got really angry and I said to my boyfriend, like, hey, I want to write a book called Young Woke Christian and kind of talk about why these views from young people are actually really important and the church should listen to them. And he was like, well, just do it then. And I was like, no, I can't do it. I'm doing a PhD. That's way too much work. And then I asked a few friends, and they were like, "Yeah, this makes sense." So it was honestly like a leap of faith that I sent off the book proposal to SDM Press, and they came back and they were really excited. And now we're here, and it's taken about a year, so it's been a bit of an exciting whirlwind that it's all happened.
Thank you. And tell me more about the terminology, because it's actually not just written by yourself, but obviously there's quite a few contributors, and it covers so many topics from climate crisis to feminism to disability to food poverty. There's a lot of different things that you cover. But for me, whenever I started to read this book, I kept coming back to the term woke. Now, even yourself in your introduction, you would not refer to yourself as woke, but you wouldn't mind if someone called you woke. I'd really appreciate you to explain a little bit more about that before we go forward.
Yeah, so woke was kind of used like more in like retaliation rather than idea that that's a label that we will put on ourselves. Um, And I think I also was really conscious about like how in often youth work and like academia that talks about young people, there's like there's a big like homogenization of young people. Young people all think X or young people all think Y, and generation X or Y means this. And I'm quite resistant towards that. So when I was thinking about how this book could look, I was thinking about all of the issues that I know that young people are passionate about, and kind of realizing very quickly that I'm not the best person to talk about each one of these, but I know so many other young people who are brilliant and they wrote them so well. So kind of that was the idea of getting as many young voices as possible to kind of push against this homogenization. And then the woke side, yeah, I was using it kind of. I also think that it's just being misused so often and misappropriated, the word woke, and like slung into the sphere of something negative. But actually, the word woke, historically, when we go back to like the meaning and this idea of like a Black consciousness, and especially Angela Davis talks about it in like the intersectionality between like in the segregation in the States after just post slavery, like this idea of being Black and a woman, that you had to navigate almost differently in the world. And so, in no sense can I say, as a white woman living in Britain, that I have to be woke, but I can aspire to be woke because that's something incredible to be able to live and flourish and prosper in a world that structurally is against you. So, kind of that's where it's come from, is that we're not saying like, we're woke Christians, we're like justice fighters. We're saying we're trying to help the church align itself with the eyes of someone who lives like under the boundaries, the kind of liberation kind of theology idea. I hope that explained it okay.
It does, thank you. On that note about liberation theology, I'd like to introduce Professor Anthony Reddy into our conversation, who's the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture and who wrote the foreword. So I have two questions for you, Anthony. Thank you for joining us. One is why support a book like this, why you feel like it's important in the world, and the other one is a question about liberation theology itself, because you said in your introduction that you thought that being young is a form of marginalization in itself and might have to be included in liberation theology. Would you mind covering both of those questions, please?
Indeed, yes. So this may be hard to believe, but I was once young, although it was some time ago. And I remember that feeling of being invisible, of being taught that like you were the church of tomorrow, but somehow like you were not the church of now. And the way in which the church often gets itself stuck between tradition, which as I understand it, is something that is always remaking itself, and sort of traditionalism. And traditionalism is static, and it is rigid and doesn't change. And often, and although our churches will talk about tradition being an important part of every denomination has its sense of tradition that sits alongside its engagement with the Bible. Oftentimes, and a lot of our churches are very much stuck within a form of traditionalism, in which the challenge that comes from young people, the challenge to engage with the world, the challenge to take seriously the issues that they are taking seriously, something that the church has never done particularly well. And so that was my case really back in the day when I was a youth worker. So in the Methodist Church, in what was then the Methodist Association for Youth Clubs, MAYC, we had this thing called Charter. I can't remember what the second or the number was, but it was called Charter something. And the idea was it was this youth charter that was going to revolutionize the church and was going to put front and center the voices of young people. And it didn't change a thing. Nothing happened. It was a good idea, came and went. Methodist Church has largely continued as it was. And so when Victoria approached me and said, actually, could I support this and write it forward, it was something that I was very delighted to do. I think, secondly, I think being young is a form of marginalization. I think particularly within the church, not within the broader scope of the world, but I think because we are, as a religious phenomenon, we are invariably looking backwards. That's where we think. We look backwards and we look at scripture, we look at tradition as our way of looking forwards. So I think because the church invariably looks backwards first as its point of departure in terms of trying to understand where it goes forwards, it invariably gives precedent to people who have knowledge and authority. And so I remember 20 years ago when I got my doctorate, and overnight, literally overnight, as a layperson, I suddenly became important. Part of that, I had an opinion that some people listened to. Suddenly I got a doctorate, I became important. And that left me feeling slightly uneasy, because on the one hand, it was great to be listened to, but on the other hand, it was simply therefore a form of a kind of reification, really, of all the existing things that are not good and should be changed. And so therefore, I think for me, I see being young as a form of marginalization within the life of the church, because by definition, if you are young, what you don't have is a huge amount of experience, and what you don't have are levels of authority. And because we tend to think in those terms around through whom can God speak? Through whom can God give forms of revelation that we can listen to? And although our different traditions, and certainly in Methodism, we say that actually revelation comes from the whole people of God. And that would be similar, I think, for that the church. I think that would be similar for the URC church as well, in terms of this sense of God is revealed through the whole people of God, including young people. That's the rhetoric. The reality is that like, we don't really do that. And therefore, what I wanted to do is just to give a little bit of my authority to say to those people in the book, actually, good on you. Just speak out and be yourselves as I said at the back end of the foreword, that it was interesting in that when I was preaching a sermon in our chapel in Oxford, and I was looking up Malala Yousafzai and also Greta Thunberg. And it's interesting if you go on YouTube and see some of the vitriol that is thrown at them. And it's thrown at them because they're young and they're women. And basically it's almost this sense of who are these people who have the temerity to dare and tell us what we should do? They should know their place. I mean, so like there's at least one who said, well, really what Greta Thunberg should be doing is going back to school and get a proper education, and her parents are being very, very irresponsible in letting her run around and be engaged in all this woke behaviour. So I think I think for me, I would have loved to have seen a book like this 30 years ago when I was younger.
Thank you very much, Professor Anthony. Victoria, you have something that you would like to share and add on to what Professor Anthony has said.
No, I just think, well, obviously everything Anthony says is brilliant. But what you're saying about like young people not having enough experience, this is a really big problem, I think, because I've heard of so many friends trying to go for ordination who feel a really strong calling, and they're dismissed in the different panels by saying, oh, well, you don't have enough life experience. And they're like, well, what kind of life experience do you need? And they're like, oh, we'll go work in a shop. Well, I worked in a shop since the age of 14. And so again, we have this homogenization of young people don't have X or Y, but actually their different backgrounds can be so important and influential that actually if we have a whole generation that's stigmatized and not going for ordination, like we have big problems in nonconformist denominations, especially that young people don't feel like even able to apply, then I think the church needs to have a big look at itself and think about how is it that this whole generation is not even thinking about that life, that way of life for themselves, even though so many of us, as you can see on our panel, are Christians.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce some of the contributors of the book now, who we have on our call. There's quite a few chapters in the book, so we don't have everybody here. So for those who are listening in who have read certain chapters and have something to say about certain topics, some of those authors are not here today, but the ones we do have, we have the ones from chapter 4, chapter 5 and chapter 9. So I'd like to introduce Josh Mock, who for chapter 4 wrote Queer, Christian and Tired. He has a languages degree from SOAS, he's a lifelong Anglican, and he sat on the Student Christian Movement Board of Trustees in the past. I'd also like to introduce Molly Boot, who wrote the chapter 5 on purity culture, trauma and learning to embody liberation. She's a theologian, broadcaster and musician, and ordinand in the Church of England. And also we have Anna Tuomo, who wrote chapter 9 on food poverty, bread of life or bread for life, who is currently at the World Resource Institute researching behavioural science and climate change and is a 7th generation Methodist. So I'd like to bring in Josh first, if that's okay. Hello, Josh. Thank you for joining us today. Your chapter on Queer, Christian and Tired. There's something about how queer liberation movement is now too tame. That's kind of some of the aspects from your chapter that I received. And you speak quite a bit about transgressive activism being a great way to move things forward, and how that's been lost in some of the ways Christians can support and be heard in the world of LGBTQ and religion. Can you give us a little overview of your chapter, if that's all right, and talk a bit more about transgressive activism?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me today. I feel that as a queer community, our activism in the church has moved away from what previous generations would do, which was stage protest, and has moved instead towards dialogue and a more academic approach. And in my view, this is futile because dialogue with your oppressor while they're still oppressing you won't lead to liberation. And it's very, very easy for churches to just ignore queer voices, or to give the impression that we're being listened to, but in fact, nothing changes. Transgressive activism goes out of what I would call the usual channels, the accepted ways of talking about things and raising issues, and instead states that we're here and we have an issue and we're not just going to go away. And in my view, true queer liberation in the church won't happen until we regain that sense of transgressiveness, which in my view is biblically justified.
Would you please explain a bit more about how you feel it has biblical foundations?
The one example that scholars often use is Jesus overturning the money changes in the temple. This idea that that's a very transgressive thing to do. Jesus is deliberately upsetting what is going on, and he's not, lodging a complaint with the temple. He's not doing what he normally does, which is to tell a story or to make people think or pose difficult questions. He literally is flipping tables, and that's impossible to ignore. You can't ignore the fact that someone is disrupting what is going on, and I imagine at the time many people would completely disagree with that, as many people completely disagree with some of the transgressive techniques that have been used in activism in the past. However, people remember those transgressive acts and they talk about them, and it gets the conversation actually moving forward. So I think we need to, being more Christ-like in activism is about not being afraid to overstep what is acceptable.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Molly Boot at this point, because leading on from what Josh Mock was just saying about the type of Christianity, what we need to do to be able to move forward. Your chapter on purity culture, trauma, and learning to embody liberation. This subject matter is something that for many Christian denominations is, just like many of the other subjects in the book, is quite a highly contested topic. I'd like to know more about how you think this is a woke Christian issue, that first and foremost, for those who haven't read the book.
Sure. I mean, taking woke writ large as a sense of speaking truth to power, as a sense of working towards a more just way of existing. I think that tackling purity culture incorporates so many different issues, from whiteness, because purity culture exalts white aesthetics, and certainly it's built mostly in evangelical culture around a very white Western understanding of the body and of what it means to be an embodied and sexual human. It also incorporates things to do with gender and sexuality, and as Anthony Reddy was saying earlier, oppression against especially young people and controlling young people's freedom and sexuality. And so it is a deeply intersectional issue, and it is an issue of justice, and it's pretty pervasive in a lot of our churches. It's often associated with the more conservative or charismatic end of the evangelical church. But actually, if you look quite closely at our sexual ethics throughout the church, there are threads of quite oppressive sexual ethics that we can be quite uncritical of, I think.
Thank you. I have one more question for you from my perspective, which was there's a line in your chapter where you say, loving God erotically might make people uncomfortable, but you say a resounding yes. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by this?
I absolutely can. So in one of the reviews of the book so far, someone said, what I've done is I've conflated erotic desire and passionate desire. And I did that on purpose. So I'm glad they spotted it, because I think that eros, this way of loving which is passionate and embodied and takes the whole of ourselves, is absolutely the way in which we love God. And we see examples of this throughout Scripture. I pointed out the Song of Songs as kind of the paramount example of that, and the way that it's been interpreted throughout Christian history. If you can take what is a erotic Hebrew love poem and have patristic authors and medieval authors interpreting this as an allegory of the love between Christ and the church, and even Jewish rabbinic authors doing the same with the love between God and the Jewish people. That's what Rabbi Akiba did with the song. Then, of course, there is this deeply embodied, sensual, I would say, erotic, passionate love that is part of the way that we deal with the relationship between the human and the divine. And I'm far from unorthodox in saying that that makes sense. This has been a thread of our history for far beyond and before the Christian faith into the Jewish heritage that we're so privileged to be able to share a part of.
Interesting. Thank you, Molly. I'd like to bring us to our final contributor, which is Anna Tuomo, hello, who's chapter 9 about food poverty. Now, it's quite an interesting chapter because for many people, the understanding of how the church writ large and Christianity as a whole has supported the poor and has been very involved in food banks and poverty alleviation and those aspects. But Anna, you sort of have decided to share a more radical way of looking at this. Would you mind quickly giving us an overview of what you think the solutions might be?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Saoirse. It's interesting you describe it as radical because I don't even see it that way. I kind of see it as really obvious. Food poverty shouldn't exist. It's an embarrassment to all of us. Jesus very clearly said that we shouldn't have to worry about what we're going to eat, and which means that in a very literal sense, we should all be sharing what we have, and there is more than enough food on the planet to feed all of us. And I used to work for the World Food Programme, and so I very much so understand that international food aid sector because I worked in it for so long and I also studied it. And they have very much so shifted their paradigm from a needs-based, which is providing food when people need it, to systemic shift, which is making sure people never need food in crisis. And I think there's nothing more gospel than that. And I come from a very strong Methodist background, and John Wesley, I write about it in the chapter. It was a major point of his ministry was ministering to the poor, ensuring that they had enough. And so I think that the church should be involved in political movements. It should be encouraging its participants to be involved in political movements. It should be encouraging protest. It should be encouraging large-scale systematic change, which recognizes that these issues that create food poverty are based on all different inequalities. In this country, people from a BAME background are much more likely to be entrenched in food poverty than people from a white working class background, which shows that it's so much more complicated than simply people being hungry. And I think civil society has a big role to play in that, as we saw in the COVID pandemic. And yeah, my chapter really lays out where I think the church is currently failing in doing that.
Thank you, Anna. That's really fascinating. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Pete Phillips now, if that's all right. Having heard from 3 of the contributors, from the forward writer and from Victoria, the editor, do you have any initial reflections to share at this point about things that have piqued your interest or that you might want to challenge or question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's also really, really important to hear these voices in this book because they're breakthrough voices. They're voices of young people who are putting their heads above the parapet, as it were, and saying, we've got things to say. So it's great to have this conversation, and great to have the book as kind of conversation opener, conversation starter. And I just want to say we should allow the conversation to keep going because we need to have this conversation. It's good for them to prove that this is not a missing generation, because simply there are so many people out there in so many good universities, so many good colleges, so many good workplaces, so many good places of action, like Anna was talking about, and so on, who are raising big issues for the church of the 21st century. And that's really, really important as well. It's good that these are prophetic voices, and they're kind of saying, where do we go with this? How do we do this? And so on. I think because that there are ways in which we need to enter into a critical process of engaging with these voices as well. How do we deal with them as a creed and so on? How do we deal with them, the changes that they may well suggest that we make with the church? Because at times those voices are universalizing. They're saying kind of, this is the way we think. And the we sometimes is a bit too big. I think it's almost as though it's an assumption that everybody has to think this way. Anthony has a very difficult passage for me in the opening, where he says that anti-woke is to support the empire, to support global capitalism and so on, to support traditionalism and what have you. And I just don't think that's a fair reflection upon to say that all young people have to be woke, have to follow all these agendas in order to be a genuine Christian. That's just not the case. We need a conversation about where we go with our various attitudes and feelings. I think that the conversation is really the most important thing. How do we hold people into that conversation and make it something that is open and valuable and good, listening to one another, rather than kind of demanding allegiance to every single issue that the book proposes. I think that there has to be some way in which we can say there is a bigger picture to look at, because these all seem prescient to us at the beginning of the third millennium. But there are many, many issues which are pressing to us at the beginning of the third millennium. And who says there won't be more that arrive? As we talk about digital theology, there's nothing here about digital rights. There's nothing here about cyborg rights. There's nothing here about the development of AI and so on. These post-personal, kind of cross-personal agendas may well need to be looked at as well. So wokeness doesn't necessarily, being woken to an issue, doesn't just limit us to these issues. There may be other issues as well.
Thank you. Victoria, I'd like to bring you back in, if that's all right, and ask you a bit about the intended audience. Because, of course, you know, with a sentence like young, woke and Christian, words from a missing generation, I'm sure even just the name of the book is meant to sort of create a reaction within people of either sway. Who is this the intended audience for? And who do you think dislikes this book or wouldn't like this book?
Yeah, of course it's meant to invoke a reaction. That's the point. What's the point of publishing something if you don't want people to feel about it, right? On one hand, I wanted it to be for young Christians who maybe were in a church where they were like the only young person and everyone else is above 60. Like, I just wanted them to feel like you're not alone. The kind of things that you're pushing for, we're pushing for too. There are other people that think like you or could challenge you. And that, you know, that kind of community sense, where I think in so many local churches young people don't have a community, and especially things like the student Christian movement and all of these support networks getting smaller and smaller and smaller, just kind of a way to reach out. And then I think it's more also for like church leaders and youth work as well. So the whole challenging the whole missing generation concept, I wanted to put that towards like people who study youth. Like I'm really questioning whether we can study youth. It gets on my nerves. Like almost that other people are more of an authority on the voice of young people than young people themselves in churches. And the missing generation idea, like how actually calling us the missing generation kind of keeps us outside the church, because if we're missing, then why would you bother to come and talk to us, right? Like, we're not here already to integrate. And then I mean, I think aligning with what Josh explains in his chapter, this book wasn't created to annoy people who disagree with us. Like, they have their own publishing houses, they have their own books so they can talk about their own stances. Like, if they want to, you know, come and read ours, that's fine. But I have a big issue of people coming, reading this book with their eyes, like looking for themselves in each chapter and critiquing how the chapter doesn't align with their own beliefs. Like, that's not the point. The whole point of this book, and me as an editor, why I got so many other people was me to jump into other people's shoes and understand their experiences of their faith, how they understand their theology, how their relationship with God changes their practice. So I guess that's a challenge for people who wouldn't necessarily like, if someone says, "Oh, I'm not woke agenda's stupid," I would just welcome you to come and read it, but also be aware that it's not written for you. It's not written to convince you. It's more written for us, and kind of like to have our voice and not always have to be dragged down into dialogue, but just for us to take space. And can I just reply to some things that Pete was saying? Thank you for your support of the book. I really appreciate it. But just this idea about like the allegiance you're talking about, not all of the contributors agree with each other in this book. So some of us are even from like Pentecostal backgrounds or like different backgrounds. So like Molly's chapter, for instance, I have never had to deal with purity culture in my tradition. And my churches, and maybe I'm just lucky in my spaces, but kind of I was aware of like kind of work Molly was doing, and I was like, oh, I didn't, and when we had our book launch, one of our audience members posed the question, well, I didn't even realize this was a problem in the UK. Is this a problem for the States? And so even just like us challenging each other, and another member said that they wouldn't have proposed their chapter in this book if they thought that meant that they were then aligned to everything, because actually that would cause them problems, and we're all on our own journeys. So in that sense, I think the wokeness is us trying to say that we're all trying to work towards these justice issues, and we're coming at it from our individual angles, and we're listening to each other and incorporating each other, but that doesn't mean that we're thinking exactly the same. And I also say in the introduction that I think one of the disadvantages of the book is it's really talking to a British culture now. So there have been so much about the global church I would have liked to talk about. So my PhD is in world Christianity, but I haven't ventured outside of the UK because that would have increased the scope. Like I would have wanted to talk about Palestine and all of these other things, and just sometimes you have to limit. And digital theology was another one that's, I don't think at the moment digital theology is a justice issue for us. I think with COVID we have some issues with disability when it can be incorporated. But it just lay outside of the scope for this one. But maybe we can do another. That would be fun.
Thank you very much. Pete, you wanted to respond to this?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that really, and I think that really does help us to kind of understand that this isn't a kind of coordinated, structure, as it were. You must follow all these things. There's kind of snippets of prophetic voices all over the place in this book, and it's really good that we kind of go and listen to what the prophets are saying. Some people aren't going to accept everything. Hopefully people will pick up and reflect upon their own tradition, and then go back to the creeds and what have you, and just say, well, how does all this fit, and how do we kind of mold together what God's saying to us at the beginning of the third millennium? That's what I really hope we'll get. We'll get a very positive conversation. This conversation is where theology is made. And in a way, we've got to create that kind of sense of collegiality amongst ourselves, that openness to each of us being changed by the revelation that somebody else brings. Benedict, I think as Benedict said, that you should always listen to the youngest voice first because they're less tarnished by the world. That's a fantastic image. My problem is that it may have meant that in some Benedictine communities, the young spoke first, so the old people could speak last and conquer them. Okay, I really thank you for kind of speaking up, because we need more young voices saying that actually the church isn't just a fuddy-duddy old place. It's a place where young people have a voice and their points can be made clear. But we need lots and lots of other young people to kind of come and share their voices as well to make the conversation more and more rich.
Thank you. Just to remind everybody who's a participant and watching this, that you can also ask questions directly to the contributors in the chat. If you would like to do that, that would be amazing. For this point, I'd like to bring in Ruth Peacock, who has some questions for the contributors and participants.
Yes, I'd just like to ask Victoria, just picking up on what you've been talking about earlier. There's a sense to me through the book of a real sense of disenfranchisement. You were talking about the feeling of utter deflation after the Corbynista period, when many young people followed Corbyn, dreaming of a new future, and then nothing happened at the end of it. And I wonder where that comes from, this feeling of disenfranchisement amongst young people, both politically and in the church.
I think generally it just feels like there's a lack of hope. and like a lack of a new way of thinking about like the future in our society. Like it just feels like we're very much bogged down with, oh, this is how things are. Like, oh well, yeah, poor people can't be trusted with money, so we're going to give them food packages, and that's really normal. And just this kind of mentality, I just think is really kind of painful. I think having discussions with people who can't seem to think in another way, I think it's just really hard. I mean, I remember going to the Corbyn rally in Bristol, and I don't know how else to explain it, like than like a worship kind of thing. We were so excited that this man with different views and radical ideas, who was, and I mean, this is a really interesting word for young people, very authentic in who he was. He liked to grow his aubergines and go to peace protests. I just felt like I knew who he was, I knew his agenda, and I was very much behind it. And I think just it feels like when that kind of authenticity, I guess, is radical and seen as a threat, I think it can be really hard to see how we can even think about a new hopeful future. And I think it's the kind of same in the church, as Anthony was saying so well about like this traditionality that, oh, well, we can't do that because we've been doing it like this for thousands of years. And it's like, well, if we can't, and I mean, I'm from a reformed tradition, right? If we can't constantly reform the church and ask these questions again and again and again, we're not going to develop, And I think I'm one of those people that think conflict is good. Like John Paul Lederach's little book of conflict transformation is fantastic. Just talking about how kind of if we don't talk about things, talk about the difficult things, we're going to stay static and society's not going to develop. We're not going to be able to get to these justice issues. And I think the church a lot of the time is so afraid of upsetting people and causing divisions that actually the people who are already outside stay outside. And I think we need to expand our vision of the oikumene in the church and think about how we're not just worried about the people who are already there, but we're really, really worried about the people who are outside. And there was a brilliant speech I listened to not too long ago that was talking about how the church needs to stop from being a church like with a home church, bringing people into your homes, because the people you bring into your homes are very decent, but it needs to move to the streets, and we need to be protesting, we need to be holding hands with people who are suffering.
Well, that idea of conflict is very interesting to me, because there must be people in older generations, and you think of charities that have been in existence for decades, campaigning for around poverty, campaigning about race, campaigning about climate change. They're older, and I just wonder why you feel it's necessary to frame this as an idea around conflict in order to achieve change.
I mean, I don't see like a conflict with another generation about these justice issues necessarily. I actually think there's a bit of a gap, and the older generation to us, like our grandparents, I think in many ways are more aligned to us. We've had a lot of really nice reviews and messages on blogs from kind of 60s, 70s kind of age range, really ignited by this book, and that like they feel the fire's coming back kind of thing. But I feel like it's just that I do think this generation, we as millennials and Gen Z, Gen Y, whatever, we are like outside of a lot of the time that the national political sphere, media, and the church. And so Laura Duca published a book called, I've got it over there, How to Start a Revolution, Young People in the Future of Politics. And she talks about how politics on purpose, especially in the States, but also here, don't engage younger generations because they'll change how the voting will happen. And that the idea that I'd never think about becoming an MP, but why not? Like, why are our generation not necessarily thinking about that? Having a young person in parliament is ridiculous. And so I just think it's also this like accessibility, and that the media can scapegoat young people as well. Like if you remember in COVID, we read these reports about young people on a field having a party. Like, do you remember being a young person and being stuck at home and not being able to see your friends? Like, I just feel like we don't have necessarily the avenues for us to give our own perspective. And so kind of that's why I think this book is a good way for us to step into the conversation.
I think the media talk about old people as well, don't they? They categorize not just young people, I think, singled out. I've got another question, if you wouldn't mind, to Josh. I think you said this earlier, but just to check, you talked about transgressive activism. Did you say at one stage that you think dialogue doesn't lead to change? Is that what's at the bottom of this work of the woke movement? That dialogue takes too long to change, that in dialogue that the passion and, if you like, this radical idea that you've just been outlining is lost somehow, and therefore the only way to change is through direct action?
My issue with dialogue is that far too often we use the word dialogue and we don't actually, it's not actual true dialogue. Dialogue implies that you have two groups who are of equal power, who are of equal place in society discussing. And with liberation issues, you often have one power who is in control of everything and the subordinate power. That's not dialogue. So my issue with dialogue is that we're not engaging in dialogue, because when you have a more powerful side in the dialogue, that's the monologue, because we just listen to them and they don't listen to us, and they have the power to either implement what we say or not. So I think when the church gives up some of its power and levels itself, we truly can have dialogue. But when there is still unrepented harm caused, when there's still animosity between the sides, dialogue doesn't work because there's no equality between the two sides. So I am completely open to dialogue. I'm not against dialogue at all. But my issue is that we are not in a position to be able to have dialogue because there isn't equality between the two sides. So
are you saying that well, when you look around you in society and great things happen through dialogue, so minimum wage, for example, that didn't happen. Are you saying that didn't happen through dialogue, that it was only activism that led to that?
I mean, I don't know the specifics of the minimum wage debate, so I couldn't comment. But from my perspective as a queer person in the church, and the methods of dialogue that are often set up by churches between those sides, are they safe spaces? No. Is there equality between queer people and the leadership of the church, who have had centuries of vitriol, encouraging harm against queer people? During the height of the AIDS crisis, could we have had dialogue between queer people and church leaders who were refusing to speak out about queer people dying in the thousands? Dialogue does not work in that situation. So I think each case needs to be looked at individually. And in my perspective and in my feeling, and listening to other queer people, we're not in a position to talk because no one is listening.
Thank you for your answer, Josh. I'm just noting we do have a question that I will put to the panel in a moment, but there is a response to what you're saying, Josh, from Anna. So Anna, I'd like to bring you in quickly for this response, please.
I think I just wanted to say that part of your question, Ruth, is this age-old question that historians have been grappling with for 100 years, which is, did the enfranchisement of women, women's right to vote, was that thanks to the suffragists or the suffragettes? We don't know. It's almost certainly due to both. And I think, along with Josh, as a queer person in the church, I've been a suffragist for the last 28 years, and I'm tired of being a suffragist. No one's listening. It's really exhausting. My own tradition, the Methodist Church, recently brought in gay marriage, but even I am unhappy with the process with which they did that, because I don't feel that a strong enough line has been drawn in the sand. So I think it's almost a call to arms to the suffragettes, to those of us who can no longer be peaceful, to those of us who can no longer sit in that dialogue and be not spoken down to, but not fully listened to either, because our position and philosophy is so radically different from those that we're speaking to, that we're not even speaking the same language. And there's been a lack of the suffragettes in this movement for a long time. And I think that's part of it, is the suffragists are going strong. Where are those suffragettes? Let's have some action.
Is this about the Young Christian and Labour?
No, because I don't think that being part of the queer community is pre-necessitated by a political identity. And I don't think that young people who are conservative necessarily aren't queer or don't support the queer community. But I think it's about being young Christian and engaged, and young Christian and active. And that's part of what I speak to in my chapter is, you know, it's awesome that the food banks during the COVID crisis were able to bridge this gap, that food poverty that exists in this country that really came to light. Where do we go from there? You know, a lot of people have woken up to these issues during this COVID crisis. Now is the time to continue that activism on both sides. You know, we need both sides of the coin for there to be actually movement. And let's not forget that we've had a conservative government in this country for the last 12 years. So we need to be engaging with them, and engaging with them as suffragists and suffragettes, engaging with them in dialogue and action.
Thank you, Anna. Pete Phillips, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I just think we just need to be very careful. Ruth is kind of pushing there to kind of talk about the kind of camps that we could have, you know, around, you know, is this Labour, is this Conservative, is this, you know, and also Anna was talking about kind of suffragists and suffragettes, and going back to what Josh was saying about kind of dialogue doesn't work and everything. We just need to be very, very careful we don't jump into the very thing which I think Putin is trying to do with his restructuring of the world order, in that he wants to create a kind of neo-traditionalist model, an anti-woke empire, which wants to say that we're not going to stand for this. And he will pull much of the Muslim world with him, probably India and China as well, into that new world order. And you end up with a kind of Western progressive alliance, kind of some happy, some not, versus the East. And we just cannot end up there, because that will end up in nuclear war and the end of the world. We've got to be very, very careful that we do things in a way in which it is itself loving and caring and open to transformation and transition to allow the Spirit's work. And I think, you know, I get what Josh is saying about the hurt and the horror of the past and everything. But I'm not sure today that direct action doesn't just end up with us kind of polarizing society, which is exactly what Putin, exactly what Trump, exactly what Farage and Johnson want us to have within our society. And I think that's setting out to a different model of how we do the world. But I'm an old guy, so, you know.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat that I would really like to ask. That is from Chris Lamb, that says, what does the panel think about the phenomenon of neo-traditionalism? For example, that we've been seeing in the Catholic Church recently. There's a strong current of young people that might want to turn the clock back. I'd like to go to Molly for a response on this.
Sure. I think this is a brilliant question, and it's one that I find really interesting because I am theologically quite an Orthodox Anglo-Catholic. So I worship in an Anglo-Catholic setting. I'm being formed for ministry in that setting. And so I have what people would say are really quite orthodox views on a lot of theological issues. For me, that absolutely meets up round the back in terms of pushing for justice. There are radical threads to Orthodox Christianity and spirituality, which are untapped, which is why in my chapter I go, where do we look to our tradition to be able to give us fuel for the fire? And I look to the Hebrew Bible, I look to medieval spirituality. I look to patristic authors. These are not quiet voices. Orthodox voices are also radical voices. The specific kind of traditionalism that Christopher is speaking to, which is maybe more on the conservative end of the spectrum, I think is very interesting. I think it's maybe overblown how much it does represent young people's spirituality in general. I think quite often several traditionalist voices are pulled up and platformed, and a lot of pressure is put on them to speak in a representative way. I would say the same of us as well. You know, a lot of us have testified to how tiring and difficult it is to be seen as a representative young voice, and Victoria has very rightly said, let's break that down and critique that. But I would want to have good and interesting conversation with young traditionalists who would be willing to speak to me, and many of them are not, and say, look, we share a heritage here, and I am as excited by Marian devotion and reforming, liturgical practice and going back to our roots as you are. But let's draw on these resources and read them together and see where we go.
Professor Anthony, you spoke at the very beginning about how traditionalism doesn't change. What are your thoughts on seeing younger people that are coming forward and in some ways turning the clock back in, wishing to return to a more traditional way of practicing Christianity?
Well, that is not entirely surprising. I think within all movements, there are forms of what I would call sort of reactionary ways of being that want to go back to a form of traditionalism. I'm not so au fait with what's happened within the Catholic Church, but I know that within many Black communities, you will have forms of Christianity that are very much, I think, reflective of what the missionaries did and what Empire does. And people see that as a form of authentic Christianity. I mean, at one level, people have every choice, have every right to make the choice that they want in terms of what speaks to them. I think what I would say as a liberation theologian is that I would want to ask the critical question is that by doing that, are you really giving yourself agency and giving yourself a sense of freedom and self-determination, or are you, I think, sort of running the risk of simply replicating like the various forms of structures and systems that have limited people's freedom in the past?
Thank you. Thank you for your attendance. So thank you. So quite near the end of our briefing, I'd like to return back to Victoria, editor. How do you feel that this kind of work can continue? You said you were looking for maybe Young, Woke and Christian Mark II. And there's lots and lots of different subjects to try and cover. Whose voices do you feel need to be uplifted next?
I think part of the idea was that I didn't want this just to be a book, but like a conversation starter. So thinking about how we can actually have dialogue that doesn't feed into the normal power disimbalance that Josh has spoken about so well, for the church to really think about, so a church together in England, for instance, we had the fourth presidency controversy, where a woman who is a Quaker and in a same-sex marriage was not allowed to take their seat as one of the presidents because other churches felt uncomfortable about it. Since then, we tried to start a dialogue about human sexuality and ecumenism, and the kind of churches that didn't want this person to take the seat, didn't want to engage in the conversation. So it's kind of seeing these issues as really necessary to the church, the longevity of the church, but also the church today and our mission to the world and how we respond to the gospel and Jesus' message. So I think I want to see like an openness to thinking about how we can discuss these things carefully and elevating the voices that are oppressed rather than talking about them. So like disability, for instance, like it's time to stop talking about disabled people, but actually talking with disabled people about how to make the church more accessible. And also how we as able people can understand and see our own ableness. Does that make sense? And how our ways of being in the world are very blind to accessibility because they don't apply to us. And also, I just wanted to challenge the church about like how you actually listen to young people and whether you think it's important or not. So I draw a lot on Bonhoeffer, and I look at the Bonhoeffer's youth work. So Bonhoeffer never stopped being a youth worker until he died about at the age of around 40. And he always talked about how young people and youth work can't be separate to the church. It's not about like capitalistic ideas and, free hot dogs, can students. No, it's not about that. It's about sitting with young people, understanding the gospel together. It's not about young people having one view and older generations having another view. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say that we need to be integrated into your church structures. So please think carefully about finding a way to enable these young people to actually feel part of the church community and not outside, like their voices don't matter or don't matter yet.
Thank you very much. Well, also thank you to all of our wonderful guest speakers today. Our briefing is now over, but we'd like to let you know that this briefing has been recorded, so you will find it on our YouTube channel at the end of the week. And also we have it'll be in our newsletters, so please do sign up, and you'll find all the information that you might need. But for now, thank you very much to everybody for a fantastic conversation. And please go over to our Twitter feed where we've been live tweeting as well. So if you have anything you want to share or to continue conversation, you can do it there.